Well, welcome to episode 397 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And a few months ago, I did a video called Jazz Under the Radar, which people enjoyed quite a bit. And in that video, I didn't necessarily feature cheap records. I have a whole other series where I talk about records you can get for under 20 bucks. But these were records which were basically a little bit off the beaten track. The goal was to highlight records which may have slipped from view over time, but which are still worth seeking out. And I enjoyed making it quite a bit, so I decided to make Jazz Under the Radar its own series. And so this is a second installment. In this video, I'm going to mention 10 more records that fly under the radar. Now, what do I mean by under the radar? Well, for the most part, these are by artists who are, I suppose, well-known jazz artists, but not necessarily in the top rank. They're really known these days only to more serious jazz collectors. Their records have probably not been written about much, very few recent releases, probably released on small labels. So they're records that you might not normally come across. However, because it's my channel and therefore I set the rules, I've also taken the liberty of throwing in one or two artists who are a little bit better known, but where the record is really kind of quirky or somewhat distinct from the rest of their catalog. Anyway, all that said, here are the records I'm going to talk about this time. And the first of those was released on Coral Records in 1957. It's by Al Cohn and Zoot Sims, and it's innovatively called Al and Zoot. Now, so many of the great records of the 1950s ended up being products of people who were not quite refugees of the big bands, but certainly who had a lot of big band experience and who were now, for a variety of reasons, mostly economic, working in small combos. Al Cohn and Zoot Sims had gotten to know each other in Woody Herman's band. They were part of the so-called Second Herd, or otherwise known as the Four Brothers Band. And they went on to have a long and fruitful partnership that lasted from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s, making all kinds of great records. Cohn in particular was hugely prolific around this time. Between 1955 and 1957, he makes something like a dozen records. This is the last in that string. And given all of that volume, some of these tended to get overlooked, like this one, for instance. But this is terrific. It fits the usual Sims-Cohn formula where you basically got two dueling tenor saxes. It's also got Mose Allison on piano in one of his very first recordings. Anyway, it's a really swinging date. It's well done, well worth picking up. Now, the next record I'm going to look at is from a little bit later. It's from 1971. It's by a singer called Esther Phillips. It's on Kudu, which was an imprint of Creed Taylor's CTI records, but kind of the funkier subset of CTI. Esther Phillips was one of the first wave of great R&B singers dating back to the 1950s, but she had struggled, well, she struggled really all her life, all her career with substance use and heroin addiction in particular. She struggled in the 1950s. She had a bit of a comeback in the 1960s with a series of records for Atlantic that did okay. But then Creed Taylor signs her to CTI, and her best work, I would say, comes in a 5 or 6 year period when she releases, I think, 5 records as a leader, maybe a bit more, for Kudu. This one is the earliest of those, I think, from 1971. It was actually nominated for a Grammy. She lost to Aretha Franklin, but even Aretha came to her afterwards and said, you know, you really should have won. This record is notable for her cover of Gil Scott-Heron's Home is Where the Hatred Is, but really the whole record is a banger. As usual on CTI, it's got the great sidemen that were kind of the in-house players, people like Bernard Pretty Purdy, like Eric Gale on guitar. It straddles the boundary between jazz and pop and R&B, and when you put it on, I guarantee people will say, wow, who's that? Anyway, all of her Kudu releases are worth a sniff, but this one is especially good and I recommend it. Now, here we have a set of 3 records actually, all released under one title, but 3 volumes. Hampton Hawes, this is the better known artist I guess I was referring to earlier on, All Night Session. And there are, as I say, 3 of these. They're released on Contemporary in 1957, but they were recorded on the night of November 12th, 1956 in Contemporary Studios. Hawes, of course, is another musician who really struggled with heroin addiction. He had a terrible time in the 60s. He spent a lot of time in jail, in and out of jail. But this is from happier times in the 1950s. He's working with a great little quartet. He's got Jim Hall on guitar, he's got Red Mitchell on bass, and he's got Brez Freeman, who incidentally is Chico Freeman's uncle, on drums. What's kind of wild about this is that the group went late at night, I think about midnight, into the studios at Contemporary. They played for 2 hours straight, and what you get on those 3 records is that exact session, all in a single take, track after track after track, in exactly the order they played them in. And they're just on fire. It's like a great, great club date, only better because it's recorded in the studio by Roy Dunan. Wonderful stuff, and I recommend trying to find all 3 records if you can. Now, still staying on the West Coast for this next one, this is a fine record by Herb Geller. It's called Fire in the West, and it was released on Jubilee in 1960. Herb Geller was a wonderful saxophonist and altoist who, along with his wife Lorraine, who played piano, came to some prominence on the West Coast in the mid to late 1950s. Lorraine very sadly, very tragically dies, possibly of asthma, about a year or so before this record is made. And despite his grief, or maybe because of his grief, the music on here, Herb's playing, and the overall vibe of the record is just incredible. And the lineup is quite something. Kenny Durham, I think it's actually Kenny Dorham, on trumpet, Harold Land on tenor sax, Ray Brown, Oscar Peterson's bassist, Lou Levey's on piano, and Lawrence Marable is on drums. And if that lineup sounds like they should make a good record, well, they do. So do look for this. Sometimes it's been released as that Geller Feller, or also once with a plain yellow label with just his name, Herb Geller, but in any event, grab it if you can. Now, the next record is, well, it's the second of the 2 Kudu records I mentioned. So this is from 1976 on Kudu. It's by Idris Muhammad, who is a percussionist and who had started out cutting his teeth in more traditional mainstream bop, but by the mid-1970s was a jazz funk titan. The album's called House of the Rising Sun, and it's really one for you rare groove nuts. The title track is probably the highlight, but it's very funky all the way through, and if you're a fan of some seriously groovy drumming, then this one's for you. Like most Kudu records, the sidemen are a big part of the story. Michael Brecker's on tenor, David Sanborn is on alto, Eric Gale's on guitar, and like the Esther Phillips album, Rudy Van Gelder is the engineer. So another banger, another one to pick up. Now back to the West Coast for this next one, and it's by the Stan Levey Quintet. It's released on Mode Records in 1957. Stan Levey is one of my favorite musicians from the 1950s. He was a former boxer, I don't know whether professional, I think amateur. He'd played in the big bands as a drummer, but he found a real home out on the West Coast with Howard Rumsey's Lighthouse All-Stars in Hermosa Beach. Most of his career he's a sideman, but he did release the odd album as a leader, and this one is just terrific. It's released on Mode Records, which was a label created, I think, in about 1956 by a guy called Red Clyde, who had previously been Bethlehem Records' main man out in LA. And they're notable, A, for the quality of the music, B, for the quality of the sound of these records, but also for these wonderful paintings which adorn many of the covers by an artist called Eva Diana. I'm not sure if it's a pseudonym or the artist's real name because I can't find much about the artist. But anyway, very, very beautiful covers as you can see. This one has got Conte Candoli on trumpet. It's got the much underrated and frankly brilliant tenor saxophonist Richie Kamuka, Lou Levey on piano, and Monty Budwig on bass. So again, a great lineup. It's hard to find in its original form, but it's been reissued and it's definitely worth grabbing if you see it. Now, let's move forward a couple of decades to 1980, and this record on Strata East by John Hicks called Hell's Bells. This is, as you can probably tell by the glossiness, not an original release, but it's absolutely a wonderful record. Strata East, of course, was a label which produced some great music in the 1970s, ranging from spiritual jazz to really quite avant-garde stuff to what you might call straightforward post-bop. This is kind of more of the latter. It's challenging music, but it falls, I would say, more regularly on the beautiful rather than discordant side of the line. Cliff Barbero handles the percussion, but the real star for me, besides Hicks on this, is Clint Houston on the bass. It kind of comes from that tradition begun by Bill Evans in his work in the early 1960s of having a trio in which all 3 instruments are kind of weaving in and out as opposed to one soloing and the other 2 just comping. It's updated obviously for a 1980s sound, but you can tell it's part of that same tradition. And it's not too dissimilar from the more recent work of Vijay Iyer. Anyway, this one is for anybody who likes a little bit of avant-garde goodness spread on their toast. So, next we have, well, now we're going back 20 years to this record. Now, Prestige Records in the early 1960s felt a need to start branding some of their music very clearly to let people know what kind of music was inside the tin. And so they created these 2 sub-imprints. One was Swingville, which, as you might guess, featured artists who were kind of from the swing era, and Moodsville, which tended to be more modern jazz. This one is by Frank Wess, who is an absolutely brilliant tenor saxophonist and a flute player, and you get plenty of both on this record. And he's got a great band with him, particularly Tommy Flanagan on piano. And it's another Rudy Van Gelder product, as it's a prestige record, and so like pretty much anything that comes out with this Moodsville look to it, it's worth grabbing. Now, back to the West Coast and back to Mode Records. This is by Joanne Grauer, who released one record at age 18, this one, in 1957, and then did not reappear on the music scene until the early 1970s. Why she took that period off, I don't know, maybe to have children. I really know very little about her biography. Her comeback in the 70s is admirable, but this record really is a standout in her catalog. She's only 18 when she makes this record. Nice little trio. She's got Buddy Clark on bass and Mel Lewis is on the drums. She's technically very strong, but there is this abiding sense of swing all the way through this record. Like all those original modes from 1957, it's scarce as hen's teeth in its original form, but you can find a reissue on VSOP, so do grab it if you see it. Finally, the last record I want to talk about is this one by Phil Urso from 1955 on Savoy called The Philosophy of Urso. And this is a record on which, unusually, the leader is far less well known than the sidemen, as you can see by some of those names there. Phil Urso is a tenor saxophonist who, like Zoot Sims and like Al Cohn, came to prominence playing with Woody Herman in the late 40s and early 1950s. He's probably best known for doing a lot of work with Chet Baker in the 1950s, all the way through the mid-1960s. Then goes kind of quiet, has a bit of a comeback in the 1970s, kind of getting the band back together, playing with the old guys. This is probably the best record in his catalog. It's the only one he actually leads as a sole leader, although that's a bit deceptive because it's actually a compilation of a number of different recording dates he did for Savoy between 1953 and 1954, and they eventually put it out in 55. And the sidemen he has on here are amongst some of the very best bop players in the world. So you've got Percy Heath on bass, Horace Silver, the great Horace Silver on piano, the wonderful bop pioneer really, Kenny Clark on drums, and Bob Brookmeyer is here on trombone, and a number of other players. Anyway, Urso more than holds his own, and the music is as good as you would expect. So, there we have it. Another installment of Jazz Under the Radar is in the books. Please have fun looking for these, and as always, I welcome your comments below. Thanks for watching.